Hello everyone and welcome to this revision video for Helmsley Castle History Around Us. This video is going to focus on artistic reconstructions and interpretations of the site and how you might focus on answering any questions around this. Okay, so this ties in with category M in terms of history around us, how the physical remains can inform artistic reconstructions and other interpretations of the site. A potentially quite difficult question, so I'm going to give you a few hacks and tips on how to do really well on this question. Okay, there's just your timeline of the history of Helmsley Castle, just so you can kind of look at the big story and think about some of the key things to pull out in terms of history around us. Sometimes they'll ask you to think about an artistic interpretation in a specific time period, so it's always a really good idea to be really clear on what the different time periods are. Okay, so these are all some of the artistic interpretations and reconstructions around the site. And one of the top tips for this, any type of question about this, is make sure any artistic interpretation you're thinking about who is in these artistic interpretations. So we've got the South Barbican there, the Great Hall, we've got the South Gate, we've got the chapel, we've got the Great Hall, and we've got the Tudor Mansion. And you very much want to think about what kind of people are in these interpretations. Are they the de Roos family? Have we got, for example, people like the Manners family in there? You know, what are they doing? What's our evidence for it, etc. So let's find out a little bit more about artistic interpretations. So this just shows you some of the different key features of the site in terms of like the site evidence. So you want to kind of be thinking that this is the remains of the castle that we have now. How could these remains of the castle as it looks now inform an artistic reconstruction? That's very much what you've got to think about. So any kind of answer you've got on this has got to be really rooted in site evidence. And we're going to talk about how we can do that now. Now, I think artistic reconstructions are really important because they help us to visually see how the site has changed through time, but they are interpretations and reconstructions, so that means they are a certain viewpoint of how we think the castle might have looked, but they are incredibly useful to enable us to understand how the castle might have changed through time. So we're going to think very carefully about how physical remains can inform artistic reconstructions. So here we've got the physical remains of what is now what we could refer to as the Tudor Mansion and West Tower. And this is an artistic interpretation of the castle in the late 12th century. So this is what we mean in terms of how physical remains can inform artistic reconstructions and interpretations. Now, if we were to think about something like the chapel, for example, and here is an artistic interpretation of the chapel in the 13th century, various physical remains would help to inform this. So we've got here on the left-hand side a picture of the moulded jamb, for example. We've got the remains of glazing tiles and fragments of glass with stained glass on them, for example, that have been discovered as well. So from this and from the site evidence, we can inform the shape of what the chapel might have looked like, for example. We know in terms of it following the east-west line, you know, on what part of the chapel the altar would have been towards the east, for example. We kind of know from history as well what these chapels might have looked like, but we can get the sense that they would have had these green glazing tiles, which you can see on the floor, similar actually to the ones at Rievaulx Abbey, and we can get a sense of where some of the windows are. So this moulded jamb allows us to recreate the shape of that far window, the stained glass window. So this is what we mean by using physical remains to inform artistic interpretations and artistic reconstructions and other interpretations of the site. So when we're thinking about the chapel, the physical remains of the castle show where it was located, lying from west to east and almost joining onto the east tower, suggesting the chapel was important. We've got the moulded jamb, that bit sticking up there is the moulded jamb. Remains enables us to reconstruct where the large window would have been. We've got source evidence actually that the chapel was consecrated in 1246 and had a chaplain. We've actually got the Inquisition from 1334 when William de Roos III died that tells us that a chaplain was at the castle and being paid. We know from other Catholic churches what they look like, such as the inclusion of the rood screen on the artistic interpretation. We have found fragments of stained glass which help us to reconstruct what the windows would have looked like, and fragments of the green floor tiles which helps us to reconstruct what the floor looked like, and note the green tiles depicted within that artistic interpretation. Okay, so here's more physical remains. This is of the South Gate, and that has informed this artistic interpretation. Now, one of the nice facts about the South Gate is that the gateway was really large, so you were able to go through on horseback. That's why it was made like that. So that's probably informs why the artist has included that within their interpretation, someone approaching the South Gate on horseback. Again, here's some other physical remains that form the artistic reconstruction of the South Barbican. So we've got there, for example, the modern day picture of the South Barbican, and then we've got the artistic interpretation of the South Barbican there, which is from the 13th century. Okay, so site and source evidence to use to inform an artistic reconstruction of the South Barbican. We can still obviously see the height of the walls and the evidence of the round towers. There are holes in the walls above the South Barbican where the hoard would have been slotted into. Now the hoard is that wooden fighting platform that you can see on the artistic interpretation that obviously would no longer be there. And this could actually be taken off the top of the South Barbican when it wasn't needed. We've got site evidence of the drawbridge, the portcullis, and the gatehouse inside the South Barbican. We know the original building was in limestone, whereas the 14th century adaptations were in sandstone. So the change in stonework helps us to know what the original South Barbican might have been like. And we know from studying the site that the original was open backed. The original South Barbican was open backed. Now, one of the key areas to reconstruct is the Great Hall. So we've got the physical remains, the site evidence of the Great Hall on the left, and the artistic reconstruction and interpretation on the right hand side. And the Great Hall is a fantastic one to write about in the 14th century. So let's have a look at how site evidence could inform an artistic reconstruction. So there's no evidence of fireplaces, so we can interpret there would have been a central hearth with a small opening or louvre in the roof. The opening in the wall where the doorway would have been, we've got that. We've got stone jutting out at the high end, which would have supported the raised platform, the dais. We've got the location of the low end, close to the buttery, pantry and kitchen, tells us about the lives of the servants. We know there would have been a screens passage to divide the end of the hall with the service area. And we know servants slept in the Great Hall, which suggests diversity as well. So lots of evidence in terms of the Great Hall. Here we've got the physical remains of the Tudor mansion and an artistic interpretation of the Tudor mansion during Tudor times, 16th century. Site evidence to use here, the footings of the loggia, small stone circles on the ground will help inform the loggia. We can still see the remains of the base of the medieval chimney. We have the footings known as the corridor of the Elizabethan long gallery. Inside the Tudor mansion, there's lots of site evidence, such as ornamental plasterwork, ornate wood panelling, fireplaces, the oriel windows. We've got the remodelling of the windows in the West Tower and the floors in the West Tower as well. In terms of creating an artistic interpretation about the English Civil War and Jordan Crossland's surrender with honour, we've got Jordan Crossland's surrender with honour document, we've got parliamentary newspaper reports, we've got site evidence of the East Tower and its slighting, artefacts of spurs and Civil War weaponry, evidence of typical 17th century clothes, and the diversity of the two sides in the war. Evidence of cannon shot and the unexploded mortar bomb would all help us to recreate an artistic interpretation about Jordan Crossland leaving at the end of the siege of Helmsley Castle in 1644. Now, other interpretations at Helmsley Castle to be aware of. Outside the South Barbican are some statues of military figures. They are bronze archers poised for battle. This interpretation focused on the military nature of Helmsley Castle. The museum inside what used to be the Tudor mansion very much focuses on the history of Helmsley Castle during the English Civil War, probably because this is one of the most nationally significant events that's taken place in the history of Helmsley Castle. Another type of interpretation are reconstruction models, and we can use site evidence to inform other interpretations about Helmsley Castle. So in the museum there is this reconstruction model, and we can see there that this shows the kitchen, pantry, screens passage, the buttery, the Great Hall, and also deliveries. Now these reconstruction models are in the castle's museum, and they help us to visualise the service area of the castle and draw conclusions about the life of the servants and workers of the castle. The screens passage would have shielded people from the Great Hall from seeing the activity in the service area, emphasising the diversity in people's lives at Helmsley Castle. The deliveries outside remind us of the connection of Helmsley Castle to the wider community. So that's a great interpretation to actually think of as well. So these are 3 past questions that are focused on artistic interpretation. So 1, explain how the physical features of your site could be used by someone to produce an interpretation of their site that shows how it was used at a significant point in its history. Imagine that an artist had been hired to do a painting showing the diversity of everyday life at your site at a particular time in its past. What would you tell the artist to help make the painting historically accurate? And your site wants reconstruction drawings to show what your site looked like at a particular time in its past. Explain what you would tell an artist to include in the drawings. Use physical features of the site as well as your knowledge to support your answer. So we'll just have a look at a couple of example answers for this question. Remember, if it's about diversity, it's got to have different people in it. So you could use something like this, and it's got to be rooted in site evidence, remember. I would make sure that the painting focused on the south barbican of the castle in the 14th century. The south barbican is a grand entrance to the castle. Site evidence can be seen of how the south barbican was extended during this time period to create domestic living quarters for the growing castle, including the constable, so it was no longer open-backed. The south barbican also created a dramatic entrance to reflect the power and importance of the lords of Helmsley. Therefore, I would advise the artist to portray members of the De Roos family returning to the castle on horseback. To reflect the diversity, I would portray local people paying homage to their lord. This homage basically means showing respect. This may even be one of their retainers, who were increasingly prevalent in the 14th century. Retainers were people who served the lord and were reliant on their protection. Site evidence of the remains of the south barbican with its entrance and strong defensive features, including a drawbridge over the ditch, reinforce this. Okay, any question around artistic interpretations? If you can write about the Great Hall, I would. I call this the Great Hall hack. I would ask the artist to portray the Great Hall, West Range and kitchen area to reflect the diversity of the castle. I would tell the artist to focus on the Great Hall at the time of a great feast taking place. I would tell the artist to portray the De Roos family and the lords of Helmsley sitting on a raised dais at the high end of the Great Hall. Site evidence exists today of the footings of this platform where the family would have sat so they could be seen. This would reflect the diversity, showing the family living a life of luxury and being more important than others. I would include the special door where they entered through from their residence at the West Tower. Site evidence exists today of the footings of this doorway, enabling this to be accurate. I would also portray the servants bringing food on big dishes called chargers. Site evidence exists of these chargers as fragments have been uncovered by archaeologists in the 20th century. Portraying the De Roos family alongside the servants who lived harder lives with lots of work would help understand the diversity of different lives and jobs at the castle. So that is a great example of how we're using specific site evidence to construct a specific artistic interpretation. So a great thing to think about when you're thinking about artistic interpretations, reconstruction drawings, that type of thing. Think about the ones that already exist and think about what historians would have done in order to create those artistic interpretations in the first place. That's why I call that the Great Hall hack. Okay, so thanks for watching that revision video about artistic reconstructions and other interpretations at the site. Hope that's been useful. Bye bye.